Along the shattered line of soldiers, orders were whispered from man to man. Some missed the message entirely, hidden off in the brush, while others simply didn't believe it when they did. They fought on anyway, one man, one rifle, each shot aimed at the enemy, each bullet a final stand. Corporal Hall crawled through the dust to share the news with Privates First Class Breen Ridge and Wallace. Ridge had once bet they'd never see sunrise and lost, only to wager again that they'd never see it set. Now Wallace murmured, "Guess you're winning that second bet, Breen." Both men removed the bolts from their rifles and hurled them into the brush, making sure the enemy would struggle to find them usable. They sat in silence, waiting. As they waited, Wallace pulled out a letter from his girlfriend back in Pennsylvania, a letter that had somehow survived the gunfire and heat. She'd written to reassure him, believing that he was safer in the Pacific. He carefully tore it into small pieces, letting the scraps drift away with the wind, both men watching silently as the fragments scattered over the sand. Meanwhile, at the artillery positions, Marines took drastic steps to prevent their equipment from falling into enemy hands. Blankets were stuffed into gun barrels and fired to permanently disable them. Grenades were dropped into the muzzles. Firing mechanisms were smashed. In Lieutenant Lewis's battery, they used pistol shots to render their height finder and director useless. As Sergeant Robert Box fired into the height finder, a bullet ricocheted, injuring him in a bitter twist of fate. A soldier who had survived the chaos of battle, wounded now by his own hand. He cursed his luck, venting his frustration in a flurry of words that filled the air. With their weapons and gear destroyed, the Marines gathered on Peel Island and Peacock Point, savoring their rations as if it were a last meal. What was the point of saving food now? About 40 minutes after the surrender order had been passed down, Lieutenant Lewis led his men to the command post. He reported with a stoic expression, "Sir, the guns and fire control equipment of E Battery have been destroyed." Around him, his men gazed at the white flag nailed to a post, bewildered, even resentful, as the battle raged on in the distance. The struggle was still alive, but they'd been ordered to quit. Addressing his men, he admitted, "I don't know if any Marines have ever surrendered before, but these are the orders, and they'll be followed." As they sat on the ground, tension broke in small ways. Someone joked that they might end up in a salt mine in Manchukuo if they weren't shot first. A Marine quipped, "Join the Marines and see the world the hard way," and the group laughed. Someone shared hoarded chocolate bars, splitting them in halves to make them last, and so they waited, chocolate in hand, for the inevitable. Platoon Sergeant Bernard Kettner approached the command post, stopping by Major Hall with a firm handshake. "Don't worry, Major. You fought a good fight and did all you could." With a nod, he returned to the front, and Major Hall took up the phone again, knowing the enemy was near. He called the hospital, hoping to warn them to raise a white flag, but got no response. Sergeant Malik volunteered to bring a flag, tying a rag onto a handle, and the two began the tense walk down the road. Unaware that the Japanese had already taken the hospital, they continued forward. The enemy had celebrated their capture by firing into a crowded dugout, killing a civilian and wounding a naval officer. When Malik and Hall reached the hospital, they met a Japanese soldier at the road, his rifle aimed and bayonet fixed. He motioned for Hall to remove his helmet, pistol belt, and empty his pockets, allowing him only his handkerchief and wallet. Malik was even forced to take off his shirt, leaving it in the dust. With the bayonet urging them onward, they began their march into enemy lines. We had barely taken a few steps when we saw the second man from the Japanese advance party standing on the road. As we approached him, a gunshot rang out from the brush and the Japanese soldier collapsed. I shouted, "The order has been given to cease firing. Obey that order." It was likely one of Potter's men, unaware of our surrender and unable to see our white flag. Our Japanese guard didn't react. He merely gestured for us to keep moving, showing no pity as he turned over the fallen man's body. When we finally reached the hospital, we found it nearly deserted, except for around 30 American soldiers, many wounded or sick, stripped down to their underwear and shoes. They were forced to sit in rows, hands bound behind their backs with telephone wire. To add cruelty, one end of each wire was knotted around the men's necks, so any attempt to relieve their wrists would only tighten the noose around their throats. 8 machine guns were positioned behind them, ensuring no one could escape. Japanese soldiers guarded the hospital door, one of them brandishing a sword, a clear sign of rank. When I asked if he spoke English, he answered with a simple, "Yes." I said, "We are surrendering." His face brightened with a mix of surprise and relief as he ordered a cigarette for me. Despite his calm demeanor, he seemed tense, as if suspecting our surrender might be a trap. When I inquired where he had learned English, he responded, "Studied at school, San Francisco World's Fair, 1939. Just then, a stir erupted nearby as a Japanese sentry halted one of our trucks. Commander Cunningham emerged, impeccably dressed in his formal blue uniform, a sight that momentarily stunned me. The Japanese officer, unsure who held command, looked back and forth between us. When he asked, "Who number 1?" I pointed to Cunningham, affirming his authority. While Cunningham prepared the formal surrender, Malik and I set off across the island to ensure all personnel received the surrender order. Accompanied by our Japanese escort, we made our way to the command post, where I confirmed that nearby troops were disarmed. From there, we headed toward Camp 1, crossing an airstrip as the sun climbed higher in the sky. As we did, we encountered the commander of the Japanese landing force, a Navy captain with a wounded hand. He didn't speak English, but he handed me a notepad and pencil, knowing that many Japanese could read English. I scrawled, "I will stop the fighting," and passed it to him, leaving further details to another Japanese officer in our party. As we moved on, I spotted Lieutenant Hanna's gun, a 3-inch beach defense cannon that had become the last bastion for a small group of Marines and civilians. Surrounded and battered, they'd held off wave after wave of Japanese attacks, with heavy fire raining down on them from revetments once built to shield American planes. Rifle grenades pummeled the position relentlessly. Of the 13 defenders, 3 had been killed and 9 others wounded. Only Captain Theron remained unscathed, still fending off as many as 200 Japanese troops when I climbed up onto the revetment and called out, "This is Major Deo. The island has been surrendered. Cease firing." At first, no one responded. I walked closer, shouting again that the battle was over. Finally, a few men emerged, slowly, wounded and exhausted. Major Putnam approached me, his face smeared with blood from a gunshot wound to the jaw. He managed a weary smile and said, "Jimmy, I'm sorry. Poor Hank is dead." Sergeant Hank Elrod had been a fierce warrior, his bravery seared into the memories of those who witnessed his last moments. When a wave of Japanese soldiers charged, Elrod had risen up, Tommy gun blazing, single-handedly breaking their advance. A grenade was in his hand when a Japanese soldier, hidden among the bodies of his fallen comrades, took a fatal shot. Elrod died instantly, still clutching the grenade, his eyes unyielding even in death. Alongside him lay Robert Burt, Brian Paul, and Gay, a group of civilian volunteers who had given their lives in defense of that gun. The Japanese separated Major Putnam, Captain Theron, and Lieutenant Hanna from the other men, leaving each group under close guard. Meanwhile, Malik and I continued toward Camp 1, pausing only when we stumbled upon yet another scene of resistance. In the generator pit, Lieutenant Clea and his 3 sergeants had been desperately working to disable the airstrip by setting off dynamite. Despite repeated Japanese attacks, they had refused to abandon their mission, fending off assaults while working on the stalled generator. As we approached, they hesitated, unsure whether to trust us. One of the sergeants gripped Clea's arm, urging, "Don't surrender, Lieutenant. It's a hoax. Marines never surrender." After a long pause, Clea finally stood, weary and defeated. The Japanese soldiers in our escort took them under guard, leading them away. As I walked on, a silent prayer of thanks crossed my mind, thankful that Clea's attempt to blow up the airstrip had failed. Had they succeeded, we might not have survived the crossing, and even if we had, the Japanese would surely have executed us in retribution. Each step through that occupied territory carried a weight of loss and defiance. Even in surrender, there was an unspoken strength among the men who had fought to their last breath, each of them a testament to the courage and resilience that marked their final stand. We gathered near the 2.50 caliber machine guns still defending the edge of the airfield, then moved forward, following the echo of small arms fire toward Camp 1. As we approached, we saw 50 or 60 Japanese soldiers in a firefight against unseen troops, and they appeared to be losing ground. Spotting us, they hesitated, then some turned to fire on us despite our white flag flying clearly. A group of them, maybe 24, charged with bayonets, but the junior officer in our escort, wielding his sword, shouted at them until they stopped. Yet they jostled and pushed us, rummaging through our pockets. They didn't take anything, not even as a keepsake, simply tossing our belongings aside, including my wallet with the only photo of my wife and son. As the skirmish cleared, we spotted Marine Lieutenant Poindexter with about 20 of his reserve troops pushing back the Japanese. Poindexter had planned to push his way across the airfield, hoping to flank the main Japanese force moving inland toward our command post. When he saw us standing amid the Japanese soldiers with our white flag, he grinned, assuming the Japanese were our prisoners. When he realized the truth, he was stunned, snapping his fingers in disbelief, a reaction I'd seen before in men overwhelmed by emotions too strong for words. We continued on, occasionally picking up other small groups of prisoners, with guards forcing us to walk with our hands in the air. The World's Fair junior officer allowed us to lower them at one point, but when he wasn't looking, a guard jabbed me sharply with his bayonet, signaling me to raise them again. The junior officer returned, saw this, and ordered me to put them down again, sparking an argument with the guard. The clashing orders made me wonder if this sort of discord was common within the Japanese ranks. As we neared Camp 1, I spotted our flag still flying proudly from the water tower, where we'd raised it after the flagpole was shot down. When some of the Japanese soldiers saw it, they broke into a cheer, and one soldier eagerly climbed the tower. The men beside me tensed, their fists clenched, fury flashing in their eyes. They were close to snapping, close to charging with their bare hands against armed soldiers. I quietly ordered, "Hold it. Keep your heads." Though they longed to protect our flag, any action would mean certain death. We watched helplessly as the grinning Japanese soldier ripped down our colors, stuffing them into a camouflage net before climbing back down, triumphant. Sergeant Dave J. Rush, who was unaware of the surrender, saw the Japanese soldier climbing the water tower. He later told me that he aimed his machine gun squarely at the soldier, ready to fire, but hesitated just long enough to recognize the surrender party. It was fortunate he held back, otherwise our position would have become even more precarious. Nearby, Gunnery Sergeant John Searis manned a .30 caliber machine gun by the small boat channel and hadn't seen us either. But when he spotted a Japanese dive bomber swooping down, he opened fire. The .30 caliber was typically meant for ground defense, but Searis took down the plane with expert precision. We saw the pilot jettison his bombs before the plane went down. Though impressive, this victory made our situation tense as our Japanese escort also witnessed it. Thankfully, they only prodded us along toward the channel, though our own dynamite-laden barge remained undetonated due to failed communications. The civilian volunteer guarding the barge hadn't felt he could blow it without direct orders. I decided to tell the sword-wielding lieutenant about the barge, as there was no sense hiding it now. An accidental explosion could lead to a massacre. But instead of crossing the channel, as I'd assumed, he led us to the boat dock, insisting we continue further. That's when I learned that Wilkes Island was still defended by Marines. Captain Pat's small Marine detachment on Wilkes Island was putting up a legendary stand, a saga in my view, though some might think the word too grand. I've had 4 years to reflect, and no other term fits. Captain Pat, a quiet man from South Carolina, led only 60 Marines to defend an island 1 mile long and barely an eighth of a mile wide. Lieutenant McAllister's 5-inch battery was strategically placed near Cuckoo Point, while Gunner McKinstry's 3-inch guns, though lacking fire control equipment, were positioned midway along the shore for beach defense. 4.50 caliber machine guns guarded the coastline between Cuckoo Point and the 3-inch emplacement, while .30 caliber guns were scattered along the lagoon side, covering the sea-facing entrance to the small boat channel. At his command post near the searchlight, Captain Pat had only 6 men. When a false report came through of a landing on Peel Island, he ordered McAllister to send part of his 5-inch crew to reinforce the machine guns guarding the lagoon, while the rest deployed as infantry along the Seawood beach. They waited in total darkness, barely able to see each other through the rain squalls that swept across the island. Then at 1:20 a.m., the action began. Gunner McKinstry, stationed at the 3-inch gun, called Captain Pat on the field phone. "Captain, I think I hear a motor." Although he couldn't see anything through the darkness and rain, the low hum of an engine was unmistakable. Captain Pat, calculating that tracer fire might light up the area, ordered the .50 calibers to fire toward the sound. Those shots marked the beginning of Wake Island's final defense. Moments later, the glow of tracer fire illuminated a Japanese landing boat approaching the shore. Lieutenant McAllister, watching from his position, called out to Platoon Sergeant Bedell, who quickly grabbed Private First Class William Buer and armed them both with grenades. Together, they sprinted toward the shoreline, stumbling through sand, determined to intercept the landing boat before the Japanese could reach land. But the enemy had already disembarked, advancing under cover of darkness. Bedell launched a grenade, but it fell short. In response, the Japanese unleashed a storm of bullets, making it impossible for Bedell and Buer to reach the boat. Still, Bedell and Buer stood their ground, hurling grenades into the chaotic mess on the beach, fighting to slow the enemy's progress. Bedell was struck down, and a wounded Buer, out of grenades, retreated through the gunfire to report to McAllister, "Sir, they got Bedell. Hune's dead." Though injured, Buer didn't mention his own wound. Instead, he returned to the front line where the Japanese were advancing with fixed bayonets. Under relentless assault, the Marines fought in isolated pockets, only seeing the enemy when shapes lunged from the darkness, sometimes so close they could almost touch. In one clash, a Marine met a Japanese soldier at point-blank range, both falling with each other's bayonets embedded. The line held, but the battle became a deadly game of fighting by instinct alone, each side firing at the flash of the other's weapons in the blackness. In a desperate attempt to illuminate the battlefield, Captain Pat radioed for permission to activate the searchlight. It briefly lit the scene like daylight, exposing a new wave of Japanese soldiers pouring ashore with bayonets fixed. But within moments, the light sputtered out, leaving the Marines in total darkness once again. Technical Sergeant E.F. Hassig, managing the searchlight, reported that it was permanently disabled, never fully operational after being damaged in earlier bombings. Communications soon failed entirely between Pat's command post and Wilkes Island. Pat could no longer reach his men, nor could McAllister or McKinstry communicate with each other. The only remaining contact was with the .50 caliber machine gunners. Private First Class S.K. Ray, manning one of those guns, reported frantically, "Captain, they're all around me." When asked if he could keep the gun operational, Ray answered, "We can try, sir." Moments later, a burst of gunfire signaled the Japanese assault, but Ray's voice returned, steady but strained. "We're still here, sir." Captain Pat ordered Sergeant Raymond Colson to ensure the .50 calibers kept firing as long as possible. Known as a disciplined, hot-tempered Marine who always went the extra mile for his men, Colson moved into the darkness with a small team, struggling to keep the Japanese from overtaking the gun emplacements. In the dark, they fought tenaciously to push back the enemy's flanking attacks. Meanwhile, McKinstry faced a dire situation at the 3-inch gun position, now directly in the path of the main Japanese assault. The enemy was so close that McKinstry couldn't depress the gun low enough to strike effectively. In a desperate move, he shortened the fuses, causing each round to detonate almost as soon as it left the barrel, delivering explosive blasts to the enemy's front lines. Though this bold tactic momentarily halted the enemy's advance, Japanese troops continued to inch closer, crawling through the darkness and sending grenades into the Marine position. With snipers closing in on the flanks and grenades landing within his perimeter, McKinstry ordered his men to remove the firing locks from the guns. Then, under the cover of night, they fell back to establish a defensive line further inland. The Japanese quickly overtook the 3-inch position, attempting to press deeper, but McKinstry's riflemen resisted fiercely, pushing the attackers back once again. What followed was a close-quarters, blind struggle, with both sides firing blindly at each other's muzzle flashes. By 4:30 a.m., Captain Pat, lacking communication and desperate for information on his men's status, embarked on a risky reconnaissance mission. Creeping through the darkness, he aimed to locate and assess his scattered defenders, knowing that a renewed, intensified assault was likely at first light. As dawn broke over the lagoon side, an eerie silence fell. In the dim light, a Marine saw a Japanese officer advancing along the shoreline, seemingly confident he'd outpace the Marine defense. At first light, a Japanese officer appeared along the shoreline, calmly inspecting his surroundings. Private First Class, watching from a distance, asked his sergeant, "Sergeant, should I shoot that Japanese officer down there?" Platoon Sergeant Joe Stowe barked back, "Hell yes, or hand me that rifle and I'll do it." Without hesitation, the Marine took aim and fired, downing the officer. The sun revealed rows of Japanese flags, marking their positions along Wilkes Island, flags intended to keep Japanese dive bombers from mistakenly hitting their own troops. These flags, reported back to command, foreshadowed the intense aerial assault that would come as soon as it was light enough to see. The bulk of Japanese forces were entrenched around the Marines' former 3-inch gun position, well covered and flanked by riflemen and machine guns hidden behind scattered coral piles. Though they were still significantly outnumbered, Captain Pat resolved to mount an assault before the enemy had a chance to fully consolidate. Lieutenant McAllister, combining forces with Gunner McKinstry and some 25 Marines, launched a bold frontal attack. They advanced toward the Japanese position but quickly found their progress halted by heavy gunfire from behind a large rock. McKinstry prepared to scale the rock to clear it himself, but McAllister cautioned, "Assign a man for that." Before McKinstry could respond, Corporal William C. Holstead stepped forward, declaring, "I got it." Covered by the gunfire of his comrades, Holstead climbed the rock, lobbed grenades down onto the Japanese soldiers hidden behind it, and finished them off with his rifle before signaling the others to advance. Tragically, Holstead was killed shortly afterward, pressing forward against a storm of enemy fire. Inspired, Captain Pat gathered 2.30 caliber machine gun crews and 8 riflemen, flanking the enemy's position from the rear. Splitting his group, he sent Corporal John S. Johnson, Jr. with 1 machine gun to the left, while he positioned the other on the right. Coordinating with McAllister and McKinstry, who were attacking the front, Pat ordered his men to fire in short, targeted bursts, avoiding friendly fire while keeping the enemy pinned down. In the Japanese position, Marines advanced in relentless waves, hitting the enemy from the front, sides, and rear. As they moved through the area, they encountered Japanese soldiers feigning death among the fallen, waiting for an opportunity to ambush. McKinstry commanded, "Make sure the dead ones are dead." From then on, the Marines passed through efficiently, advancing with bayonets, securing the area, and flushing out the last defenders. Captain Pat swiftly reorganized his troops and continued clearing the island. Against odds, the Marines had wiped out Japanese forces on Wilkes Island, despite being outnumbered nearly 2-to-1. Of the roughly 100 Japanese troops who landed, only a handful survived, either as prisoners or feigning death. At 7:40 a.m., the sky erupted as Japanese dive bombers began another furious assault, strafing and bombing as the Marines took cover. By 8 a.m., more ships were spotted approaching from the southwest, and Captain Pat, anticipating an invasion force, ordered McAllister to reassemble his artillery, preparing to fire on any vessel that ventured within range. Marines tore down the Japanese flags, but observers failed to report this action to Pat's command. Under constant bombardment and cut off from communications with headquarters, Pat managed to connect with Camp 1, learning only that fighting was ongoing near the airfield. Around noon, the dive bombers returned, and a Japanese destroyer appeared within 2,000 yards of the channel entrance. Pat ordered McAllister's 5-inch guns to engage, only to discover that both guns had been damaged beyond repair by prior bombings. Despite this setback, Pat rallied his men, gathering all available personnel to advance to the channel as infantry and repel the Japanese boats. As they moved through coral and scrub, dive bombers launched another assault, killing Private First Class Robert L. Stevens, the last Marine casualty of the Battle of Wake Island. Meanwhile, Pat's exhausted Marines continued their determined march toward the channel, prepared to resist the landing with rifles and machine guns. Simultaneously, I was crossing to Wilkes Island under a white flag, accompanied by Sergeant Malik and under the watchful eyes of a Japanese guard contingent. Upon landing, I called out, "This is Major Dio. The island has been surrendered. Lay down your arms." No one responded. Moving along the beach, Malik and I, white flag in hand, repeated our call to surrender. Japanese troops eyed us warily, fingering their rifles, but none answered. Offshore, Japanese destroyers and landing craft were closing in. Unknown to me, these were the very boats Pat's men were preparing to repel. Suddenly, a shell exploded on shore, a warning shot from one of the destroyers. As the Japanese vessels began shelling, Malik and I kept walking straight ahead, refusing to take cover. We knew we were targets, but without a word between us, we had resolved to face whatever came, defiantly pushing forward through the chaos of Wake Island's final hours. As shells exploded perilously close, Sergeant Malik and I continued our walk forward, trying to project confidence despite every instinct telling us to duck and take cover. We were well aware of the danger, and I knew that Malik must have shared my desire to escape to safety. But we pressed on, unwilling to show fear before the Japanese soldiers surrounding us. Then, in a moment of clarity, the Japanese junior officer finally ordered his men to take cover, signaling to the destroyer to cease fire. The relief was palpable. With the firing stopped, we resumed our march across the island. As we approached Cuckoo Point, I called out repeatedly that the island had surrendered. Only then did we encounter Japanese troops emerging from the brush, worn, wary men who looked at us with suspicion, not yet believing the call to surrender. Eventually, Captain Pat appeared, his face a mix of resignation and stoic resolve. As he acknowledged our surrender, he kept a tight-lipped silence, absorbing the weight of the situation. In true Pat fashion, however, he soon broke the tension with humor, joking with our Japanese captors as they led us toward the site of the fiercest fighting. Arriving at the 3-inch gun position, a place littered with the grim evidence of battle, we saw the Japanese inspecting the aftermath. Amidst the bodies, one of the dead soldiers stirred, revealing he had been feigning death. When he encountered us later on a stretcher, I offered him water, but he refused, now defiant among his comrades, knowing we were at their mercy. At Captain Pat's former command post, we witnessed the release of 2 American prisoners. One Marine, overcome with emotion, ran to the side of his fallen brother, sprawled lifeless on the coral, calling out, my brother," in a heart-wrenching display of loss. Meanwhile, hundreds of additional Japanese soldiers began landing on Wilkes Island under the command of a lieutenant who, unlike his junior counterpart, was less than pleased. The Japanese had paid a heavy price for their hard-won victory, and the lieutenant's scowl told us he knew it. Pat's relentless energy hadn't flagged, even as exhaustion and captivity set in. When he saw a Japanese soldier with a large black sword strapped to his back, he pointed it out excitedly, joking, "Major, what do you think that's for?" My instinct told me it was likely an executioner's sword, but Pat pressed the soldier, who simply grinned back, leaving us to wonder. We were transported to the Japanese headquarters near Hana's Gun, where their commanders interrogated our officers, trying to understand the island's resources. Commander Keen sketched diagrams detailing Wake's facilities for food, water, and shelter. However, the Japanese commander interrupted, taking the pad to write a single question. "Where are the women's quarters?" Keen's response, "No women on island," seemed to bewilder the Japanese officer, as if he couldn't fathom a place without civilians. Their hospitality extended to offering us food, a canned dish of raw fish, which tasted almost foreign after the grueling march and sleepless hours. Yet even this meager meal tasted bitter in light of our defeat. Exhausted, marching 6 miles under guard with hands up, I felt a gnawing ache not only from fatigue but from the somber realization that, despite our best efforts, we had been overwhelmed. In the distance, I saw lines of American prisoners, stripped down to bare essentials, barefoot, dirty, and drained. Led by Sergeant Hassig, an iron-willed Marine who took pride in his stripes and impressive mustache, these men stumbled forward, clearly exhausted yet unwavering. Hassig's voice rang out, urging them to snap out of this. God damn it, you're Marines. With that, a remarkable transformation occurred. They straightened their backs, heads held high, marching in perfect cadence, defiant as ever. Even our Japanese guards, accustomed to seeing captives surrender in spirit as well as in body, could barely keep up with the disciplined strides of these men. Witnessing this, I felt a renewed sense of pride, a testament to the resilience and spirit that set these Marines apart. To the Japanese, our conduct was incomprehensible. They had expected fear and compliance. Yet, as they watched these weary, battered men march by in unbreakable cadence, I saw a glimmer of confusion and awe on their faces. This costly victory had stripped the Japanese of their expectations, as they encountered firsthand a level of determination they would struggle to understand. By their own admission, the Japanese invasion of Wake Island proved to be a costly endeavor, with losses including 11 naval ships, 29 planes, and over 5,700 men killed. On the American side, we lost a dozen planes and 96 lives, 46 Marines, 47 civilian contractors, and 3 sailors. The final attack on December 23rd cost the Japanese another destroyer and around 350 soldiers. Despite this, they managed to capture the island, taking full control after one of the fiercest small-scale battles of the war. Even before the surrender order reached everyone, it became apparent that the Japanese were well prepared. They had a list of every American officer on Wake Island printed in Japanese. As I overheard them checking names, the final one on the list caught my attention. It was Gunner Hamus. Later, I would learn more about Japanese intelligence methods, including how Japanese agents in Hawaii had kept tabs on American ships. Using seemingly harmless picnics and parties hosted by Japanese women, these agents kept track of servicemen's comings and goings. If a familiar group of servicemen failed to attend, the agents could often deduce that a ship or unit had deployed. When the same servicemen returned, the agents could estimate where they had gone and for how long. The Japanese seemed particularly interested in Captain Wilson, the Army officer overseeing the radio trailer. They subjected him to extra scrutiny because of an incident in 1939 when a Japanese naval training vessel had docked in Hawaii. Back then, Wilson was a civilian customs inspector. As he tried to board the Japanese ship, a sentry demanded that he bow and salute the Japanese flag. Wilson, refusing to comply, drew his pistol and forced the sentry to back down. Although the Japanese consul quickly issued an apology, they evidently had not forgotten the slight. Now, years later, Japanese officers held Wilson accountable, telling him, "You are responsible for the war between Nippon and the United States." They even threatened him with decapitation for stirring up animosity. Wilson, in a desperate attempt to save his life, argued that he was not the same Wilson, claiming that Wilson was as common a name in America as Smith or Jones. He emphasized that the Wilson in Hawaii was a civilian, while he himself was now an Army officer. Remarkably, this explanation seemed to convince them, and they spared his life. By the evening of December 23rd, all Americans on Wake had been rounded up. 10 of us, including myself and Sergeant Malik, the only enlisted man among us, were separated and confined in a single-room cottage we called the White House. Exhausted beyond words, we lay sprawled across the floor, each man lost in bitter thoughts. Suddenly, our guard snapped to attention, and a Japanese admiral dressed in immaculate white with rows of medals and a ceremonial sword entered the room. He was introduced as the commander of the task force that had taken the island. As we stood up to acknowledge him, he handed a piece of paper to Commander Cunningham, who read it aloud. The proclamation declared that Wake Island was now state property of the Japanese Empire. It claimed that the great empire of Japan, who loves peace and respects justice, has been obliged to take arms against the challenge of President Roosevelt. The notice went on to assert that the Japanese Navy would treat all those who do not hold hostility with leniency, while any who resisted would face severe punishment by martial law. Two things about the Admiral's proclamation stood out. First, the word Navy appeared on small pieces of paper carefully pasted over another word, likely Army. It seemed a subtle attempt to tailor the document to naval occupation, as if the Japanese Navy alone had claimed the island. Second, the proclamation's language seemed to imply a native population on Wake Island, a clear exaggeration aimed at inflating the Japanese victory for domestic propaganda. Japanese newspapers would later echo this, referring to the captured airfields as cities overrun by Japanese forces. When Commander Cunningham finished reading, we sat down and lit cigarettes, trying to hold on to any sense of normalcy in the strange new reality of captivity. Someone offered the Admiral a cigarette, but he rejected it angrily, glaring at us with indignation. In that moment, we understood. Our defiance, even in the smallest gestures, continued to unnerve him. Upon receiving the Japanese proclamation and observing our silent response, the Japanese admiral grew visibly frustrated. Annoyed by our lack of deference, he lashed out at the sentry in a rapid, fierce reprimand. Each time he paused for breath, the sentry would bow and respond with, "Hi," a firm, respectful, "Yes, sir." Eventually, the admiral, clearly displeased, stormed out of the room. Exhausted under the sentry's watch, we settled into a restless sleep, still hopeful that an American task force was en route to rescue us. Civilian evacuation ships were expected the next day, and we believed they might be part of a reinforcement effort. But when morning came, the only ships visible were those of the Japanese fleet encircling Wake Island. For Christmas dinner, we shared what little we had left, crackers and evaporated milk. Much later, we learned that the U.S. task force, centered around the aircraft carrier Saratoga, had been only 24 hours away from Wake. Tragically, it had been recalled, deemed too risky by Navy Command given the limited forces available after Pearl Harbor. The decision to turn back weighed heavily on the crew, with many Saratoga pilots reportedly sitting in tears on the flight deck, heartbroken to abandon us without a fight. Meanwhile, the 10 of us in the White House cottage were cut off from the other prisoners. Although we were given basic food and weren't physically mistreated, we had no idea about the severe hardships our fellow captives faced until a note was smuggled to us on December 26th. Through this message, we learned of the brutal treatment inflicted on our comrades. When they surrendered, many were stripped to their underwear, and their hands were bound tightly behind them with telephone wire, causing excruciating pain. The wire was looped around their necks, creating a choking hazard if they attempted to adjust their arms. Some remained bound long after all prisoners had been secured. The conditions only worsened as scores of prisoners were herded into overcrowded hospital dugouts at Bayonet Point, where the air was so stifling that men fainted from lack of oxygen. Trapped in such tight quarters, they could not free their bound hands to assist one another, even as men began to choke or vomit from the overwhelming stench and lack of ventilation. Among them was Gunner Hamus, who managed to appeal to a Japanese officer to release Dr. Khan to care for the wounded. This officer, who spoke English, surprisingly agreed, freeing Dr. Khan and Hamus. The doctor did what he could in the crowded, unventilated dugout, preventing some of the unconscious men from strangling themselves. Hamus bravely approached the officer again, showing him the swollen wrists of men whose circulation had been cut off by the wire. This act of compassion led to a slight loosening of the restraints, and soon the Japanese allowed prisoners to sleep outside under guard. They even permitted Hamus to gather discarded clothing for the nearly naked prisoners, though a sentry angrily jabbed him in the hip with a bayonet. Eventually, the prisoners were moved to the airstrip. With little to protect them from the wind and cold, they dug shallow trenches with bare hands in the hard-packed coral to shelter themselves. Still, they received no food, and the water provided was tainted with gasoline, forcing men to gag as they drank. Once we learned of these conditions, I drafted a formal request to the Japanese landing force commander, asking that our men be given food, clothing, and shelter. With Commander Cunningham absent, I showed it to Commander Keene, who approved. Although the commander never replied directly, we soon noticed slight improvements in our comrades' conditions. The prisoners were moved to barracks and food rations were gradually provided. Dr. Khan and Dr. Shark were even permitted to move the sick and wounded to a sheltered building, though nearly all our medical supplies had been confiscated. The Japanese, however, showed little regard for sanitation, even for their own wounded. Dr. Khan observed that bloody bandages were carelessly tossed out of windows, contributing to the deplorable conditions. Despite their reputation from the Russo-Japanese War for maintaining strict sanitation here on Wake Island, the Japanese medical personnel appeared indifferent to such standards, adding to the misery of an already dire situation. The conditions for the American prisoners on Wake Island were harsh, with many moments of tension and constant threats hanging over their heads. After a complaint was raised, direct brutality lessened, but the Japanese still exerted control with a chilling threat of execution. One episode exemplifying this pressure involved Dan Titus, who was tasked with removing hidden dynamite from under the airstrip. Titus tried explaining that he hadn't personally buried the explosives and couldn't be certain he'd locate all the pockets. The Japanese officer curtly warned him, "You'd better find them all. Don't forget, we can leave you out there when we try the detonator." Captain Theron, Gunner Hamas, and about 30 Marines were also ordered to gather and bury the dead in a large trench near the remnants of a gun emplacement. The grim duty of dealing with decomposing bodies, including those in a non-functional refrigerated storage, was worsened by starvation. In the process, the men desperately ate from jars of maraschino cherries they found among the supplies. This memory would haunt Corporal Brown, who later would feel nauseated at even the sight of a maraschino cherry back home. The interrogations added another layer of psychological strain. A young Japanese officer, evidently new and inexperienced, conducted one of the first. His line of questioning centered on suspicions of American preparedness and technology on the island. "Didn't you know our planes were coming?" he pressed. When he demanded I draw a diagram of radar, though we had no such equipment, I explained at length that only specialized operators could describe such technology, frustrating the officer until he eventually gave up. Another session with a senior officer was equally peculiar. He drove me around the island, demanding I point out the American gun emplacements, even though he already had access to these details. This revealed the underlying anxiety the Japanese command felt about our 5-inch batteries, suspecting we'd hidden larger artillery somewhere. Despite strict discipline, constant watch, and the looming threat of execution, the Marines continued subtle acts of resistance, sabotaging the very weapons they were forced to maintain for Japanese use. When ordered to clean rifles, they polished them until they gleamed, but then discreetly poured salt water down the barrels, ensuring they'd rust internally. Captured 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, seemingly pristine, were rendered inoperable when sand was subtly packed into the recoil mechanisms. Machine guns received similar treatment. Crucial parts like sears were pocketed by the Marines, who would later discard them in the brush. One Marine, demonstrating the use of ammunition primers, cleverly used up the entire supply, each act a quiet yet dangerous form of defiance. Caught or suspected saboteurs would have faced the executioner, who occasionally roamed the camp with a sword strapped to his back. In our restricted quarters, isolated from the larger group, we had limited knowledge of these acts until much later. Interrogations aside, we were allowed some basic freedoms: reading, brief walks under guard, washing clothes. Requests for basic hygiene items, however, were denied. When we asked the interpreter, a self-professed Columbia University graduate, to retrieve our toothbrushes, he replied, "There are many people in Japan who have no toothbrushes." We nicknamed him Garters due to his tendency to wear socks held up by garters. He relished escorting us to headquarters for questioning, swaggering alongside with a pistol, acting as though each interrogation were an opportunity to display his authority. The American prisoners' resilience and covert resistance continued even in captivity, with the Marines' persistent efforts to undermine the Japanese at every opportunity. This defiance persisted long after Wake, as the men were transferred to labor camps and forced into grueling work projects, demonstrating their unyielding spirit in the face of intense hardship. During our time on Wake Island, despite the constant threat of violence, there were fleeting moments where we attempted to find small comforts amidst the overwhelming darkness of captivity. The island was often blacked out at night, and in the absence of light, we tried to amuse ourselves with guessing games such as Who Am I? Or by engaging in light conversations with our Japanese guards. These men, though formidable in stature, were often surprisingly naive and eager to show off their skills. Each one claimed to be the #1 judo champion of Japan, proudly tapping their noses in a gesture that mirrored how Americans might tap their chest. They were always excited to demonstrate their abilities, but we declined, well aware that any contact would be seen as a sign of weakness or submission, something we could not afford. Despite their bravado, these guards were not immune to moments of comic relief. One of them frequently recited with great pride, "God save our gracious king, long live our noble king, God save the king." His English was poor, but he beamed with joy each time we nodded and told him he had done well. It was a strange contrast to the brutality of the situation. Another guard attempted to impress us by demonstrating his patrolling skills, what we would have called sneaking around. Captain Pat, ever the opportunist, saw this as a chance to turn the tables. He requested the guard's rifle and with a grin said, "Let me show you how the Americans do it." We all had our share of such moments where we tried to find levity in the bleakest of circumstances. But as time passed, we began to sense the shift in our reality. On January 11th, 1942, we were informed that we would soon be moved to a prison ship. The Japanese had posted a list of regulations for prisoners that made it clear how harshly they intended to maintain control. The list outlined 12 capital offenses, each one marked by a punishment of immediate death. Among the offenses were the following: any form of disobedience, making any sign of opposition, raising one's voice, carrying unnecessary baggage, or attempting to escape. A particularly sinister clause warned that anyone resisting mutually would face swift punishment. The regulations concluded with a chilling promise: those who cooperated with the Japanese and their New World Order would be treated well, while those who didn't could expect nothing but death. When we sought clarification from our guard, Guterre, on what constituted necessary baggage, he simply shrugged, "I don't know." After all, he wasn't the one risking his life. In the end, we decided to pack as little as possible, just one bag per person. I packed only the essentials: a raincoat, socks, underwear, a pair of shoes that didn't fit, a toothbrush, and personal papers that had been stamped by the Japanese officer, authorizing me to take them. This was all we were allowed to bring, for even cigarettes were forbidden. The next morning, January 12, 1942, we were loaded onto the Nauru, a Japanese liner repurposed as a prison ship. Nearly 3/4 of the civilians, along with the majority of our enlisted men, were shipped out with us, while the severely wounded were left behind on Wake. One of those left behind was Dr. Shark, the civilian doctor who had shown immense courage during the battle. I later learned that he may have been executed by the Japanese, but his fate remains uncertain. As we made our way onto the prison ship, I encountered Major Potter for the first time since the surrender. The mood was somber, and our situation felt even more precarious as we neared the Nauru. That afternoon, we were transferred to a landing craft and brought alongside the ship. A cargo net was lowered, and we tossed our bags into it before being hoisted up onto the deck. As we scrambled to collect our belongings, a line of Japanese sailors armed with clubs awaited us. While they didn't immediately strike, it was clear that the threat of violence was ever present. Once below deck, we were herded into cramped quarters, and the line of sailors followed us, ensuring we kept our heads down. It wasn't long before we realized the full extent of what lay ahead. We were told that most of the Americans left behind on Wake would eventually be shipped off to Japanese prison camps. Tragically, on October 7, 1943, the Japanese executed 98 American civilians who had remained on the island, using the excuse that they had been communicating secretly with U.S. naval forces. It was a brutal massacre carried out by the Japanese command, including Rear Admiral Shigatsu Sakara, who, along with 11 officers, would later be tried and sentenced to hang by an American naval court after Japan's surrender. The years that followed would see us subjected to forced labor, grueling work in mines, and unimaginable hardships. Yet even under these brutal conditions, there remained a flicker of defiance. Even as we suffered, the spirit of resistance, however small, continued to burn, as Marines found ways to subtly sabotage the Japanese efforts and continue the fight in their own way. We had no way of knowing at the time, but this period would be one of the darkest yet most defining chapters of our lives. The harsh reality of captivity began to set in the moment we were forced to endure the gauntlet of clubs. As we reached the foot of the ladder to board the prison ship, we were halted while our bags were inspected. Nervously, I leaned forward, hoping the inspector would notice the Japanese commander's official stamp on my papers, which authorized me to carry personal documents. But before I could point it out, one of the guards slapped me across the face with an intensity I'd never experienced. The shock was so overwhelming that I could only gasp, a reaction that may have spared me from further violence. By the time I regained my senses, we were already being pushed down 2 more ladders and into a harsh spray of disinfectant. It was a futile gesture, as none of us had been stripped or searched thoroughly, though it seemed to please the Japanese officers who took delight in dousing us with the cold, stinging liquid. We were shoved into a steel-walled compartment about 30 feet square, which had once served as the cargo hold on the ship. There were no portholes, no windows, and certainly no ventilation. The only furniture in the cramped space were straw mats scattered across the floor and a raised platform running along the bulkheads where we were expected to sleep. There was no basin for washing. We had to clean ourselves with a rag and mouthwash. Hygiene was a distant memory, and the food we were given reflected the lack of care we were afforded. Our meals consisted of bland, tasteless rice gruel and sometimes a tiny fish or a few slices of radish as a special treat. It was a far cry from anything resembling a decent meal. The guards were ever present, standing watch with bayonets and ensuring we remained silent. Any hint of whispering was met with brutal punishment. I recall one instance when Captain Pat, a fellow prisoner, was accused of whispering. Without warning, the guard beat him mercilessly with a stick. We all remained quiet, knowing that any attempt at resistance would lead to further suffering, not just for us, but for the men under our charge. In that moment, we understood the dire consequences of defiance. After 5 days aboard the Nauru, we finally reached Yokohama, Japan. Cunningham, Keene, Tedis, and I were pulled aside and taken into a cold, sterile room where we were questioned by a Japanese officer. The questions were bizarre, focusing on things the Japanese already knew: how many military personnel were stationed on Wake, how many civilians were present, and so on. It was clear that the Japanese were more interested in intimidation than in gaining useful information. The next day, 8 officers, including Major Putum, Major Potter, Lieutenant Clear, Gunner B, and others, were selected for a mysterious purpose. We never understood why these particular officers were chosen, but we speculated that it was because they represented a cross-section of Wake's defense, from the Marine Battalion to the Naval Air Station and Communications. Most of the enlisted men chosen were from the Communications Unit, further suggesting that the Japanese were particularly interested in our radio operations. There were no goodbyes, just the grim realization that we might never see each other again. The harshness of the journey continued when we set sail from Yokohama on January 19th, and the following night we were told that the door to our prison was being locked for the first time. The Japanese informed us that a submarine had been tracking our movements, and the idea of that submarine sinking the Nauru was too dreadful to contemplate. As we sailed onward, I couldn't help but feel the oppressive weight of uncertainty. By January 23rd, the ship's engines abruptly stopped. We were in the dark about our location until we were ordered on deck. To my astonishment, we had docked at the Bund in Shanghai. The cold was biting, and I had been there before in 1930, but I was too preoccupied with trying to identify landmarks to focus on much else. The atmosphere was surreal, with Japanese and Chinese reporters snapping photos of us and handing out cigarettes. The brief encounter was cold and impersonal. We were soon herded below deck again, and the next morning we were forced to march off the ship in the freezing cold. The march took us a few miles outside Shanghai to Wong, where the Japanese army took over from the Navy. As we marched, posters lined the streets inviting the Chinese citizens to watch the Parade of the Captives as proof of the invincible might of the Japanese military. But the Chinese paid us little attention. After months of malnutrition and confinement, our bodies were weak, and many of us could barely keep pace. Gunner McKinstry, for instance, was struggling to walk in shoes too large for him, his feet covered in blisters. When we arrived at Wong prison camp, we were greeted by a bleak and desolate landscape. The camp consisted of 7 dilapidated barracks, each crammed with 200 men. These makeshift structures offered little protection against the bitter cold, and we were provided with only thin blankets for warmth. The wooden platforms we slept on did little to shield us from the frozen ground. The camp was surrounded by electrified fences, and later a second inner fence was erected around the barracks and the latrines. The conditions were deplorable, and the cold was by far the most unbearable aspect of our captivity. The North China Marines who joined us at Wong had thick winter uniforms complete with overcoats, fur hats, and gloves, but the rest of us in our tropical uniforms were ill-equipped to withstand the harsh winter. Every day was a battle against the cold, and our suffering was compounded by our meager rations. Rice and tea were the standard meals, and hunger became a constant companion. The days dragged on, each one feeling more hopeless than the last, and yet through it all we clung to the belief that survival was possible, even if it meant enduring the unthinkable. The conditions in the prison camp were unbearable. The tea, made from willow leaves, tasted nothing like the comforting beverage we once knew. It was weak and bitter, a meager substitute for the warmth and relief we longed for. The rice, if it could even be called that, was often filled with pebbles, so much so that prisoners broke their teeth trying to eat it. Our meals were often supplemented by a thin, watery stew, so devoid of substance that it provided little nourishment. On days when it was even more diluted than usual, the sardonic Marines named it Tojo water, after Japan's infamous leader. Despite the relentless hardship, the Red Cross sent supplies every 2 weeks starting in the summer of 1942. We also managed to raise some vegetables in our small garden, providing brief moments of relief, but these meager resources did little to alleviate the constant hunger that gnawed at us. The guards, however, were the true source of torment. Their cruelty knew no bounds. Whether through petty harassment or outright sadistic torture, they seemed to take pleasure in every moment of our suffering. If the camp authorities did not actively foster this abuse, they certainly did nothing to stop it. Of all the Japanese personnel who tortured us in the 6 prison camps where I was held, one stood out for his insatiable brutality: Ishihara, a civilian interpreter. He had learned English while studying in Honolulu and later worked as a truck driver before being stationed in the camps. Despite his slight build and the fact that he wore horn-rimmed spectacles, Ishihara was a vicious, unrelenting man. The prisoners dubbed him the Beast of the East due to his propensity for violence. One of Ishihara's first victims was Second Lieutenant Huisenga, a former football star from Annapolis, who had borrowed some tools from our camp carpenter to make repairs in his quarters. When Ishihara heard about it, he flew into a rage. Grabbing a club, he rushed at Huisenga, beating him senseless until he collapsed, unconscious. When the flurry of blows stopped, Ishihara stood over the bloodied prisoner, panting and smirking in triumph, safe under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Ishihara's cruelty wasn't limited to our men. He once took issue with Sir Mark Young, the British Governor-General of Hong Kong. Perhaps Young had not shown the proper respect for a Japanese civilian interpreter, or perhaps Ishihara just sought an excuse to display his sadism. Regardless, he drew his sword and prepared to strike Young down, but before he could do so, Major Luther, the commander of the Marine barracks at Tientsin, intervened. Luther wrested the sword from Ishihara's hand and forced him to back down, but this brief act of defiance was a rare occurrence. In most cases, the Japanese officials allowed their underlings to act with impunity. Ishihara's violence would eventually be reined in, but not for the reasons we hoped. When Colonel Usus, the camp commandant, died in the fall of 1942, he was replaced by Colonel Otera, a man whose love of alcohol seemed to take precedence over everything else. Otera's indifference to the camp's daily operations earned him the nickname Handlebar Hank among the prisoners, due to his impressive mustache and lack of discipline. He was a chronic drunk, and his obsession with staying mellow kept him from addressing the rampant abuse of the prisoners. However, his chauffeur became an unexpected source of contraband for us, sneaking in forbidden items like electric hot plates. Then there was Tiny Tim, a troublesome officer who found amusement in tormenting us with surprise drills and inspections. Even after a long day's work, prisoners would be roused at odd hours for a fire drill or inspection, and there seemed to be no end to the unpredictability of our routine. But eventually, Tiny Tim went too far. During one fire drill, a fire extinguisher was accidentally discharged, and as it sprayed wildly, Tiny Tim's interest in surprise drills evaporated. From that point on, he seemed to lose his enthusiasm for harassing us. Throughout our ordeal, Colonel William W. Ashurst, a senior officer in the North China Marines, continually protested the infringement of international laws governing the treatment of prisoners. But his protests fell on deaf ears, and little was done to prevent the daily cruelty. The guards' treatment of us was relentless, and we had no choice but to endure it in silence, storing our anger deep within. The Japanese attitude toward us was most memorably expressed by one Japanese commander during a Christmas address. "From now on, you have no property. You gave up everything when you surrendered. You do not even own the air in your bodies. From now on, you will work for the building of Greater Asia. You are the slaves of the Japanese." These words captured the essence of our captivity. We were nothing more than property, stripped of our dignity and humanity. However, amid the darkness, there was a glimmer of light in the form of Popeye, one of the camp's Japanese guards. He had once worked as a hotel clerk in civilian life, and unlike the others, he treated us with kindness and respect. Popeye secretly gave us cigarettes and even money to buy smuggled necessities, refusing to accept anything in return. His actions were an anomaly in a camp where cruelty reigned, and his decency made him a standout figure in a time when humanity seemed in short supply. I often think of Popeye and hope that he made it through the war and is doing well wherever he may be. He was a rare soul, one who treated us as human beings, and that made all the difference in those long dark years. The daily routine in the camp changed with the seasons, but the hardships remained the same. In summer, the days were longer and we were forced to rise earlier and work later. Our day would typically begin at 5:30 a.m. when the discordant sound of the bugle pierced the air, signaling the start of another day of misery. We were mustered in the barracks for roll call and inspection, and every detail had to be perfect: bunks neat, blankets folded, and shoes spotless. Despite the absurdity of it all, we were forced to wash our shoes daily, even though the damp leather was already falling apart. As the barracks agitator, it was my job to coordinate the inspection. When the inspecting party arrived, I would call out, "Katsuki, attention," and the men would respond with a perfect "Ichi-san shai." After the inspection, I would give the order, "You may rest," the extent of our Japanese language proficiency. We tried to learn more, but the camp director's half-hearted attempts to form language classes often fizzled out, much like most Japanese initiatives. Life in the camp was a never-ending cycle of suffering, humiliation, and survival. We learned to endure, to find moments of camaraderie in the midst of despair, and to hold on to the faintest hope that one day we would be free again. But through it all, the memory of Popeye and others like him who showed us kindness when it was least expected would stay with us, a reminder that even in the darkest times there were still those who remembered what it meant to be human. After morning inspection, our routine began. We were herded into breakfast, and then the working parties of prisoners were formed. Some were loaded onto trucks and taken outside the camp to work on roads or other laborious tasks, while the rest of us remained behind, working in the camp garden, policing the grounds and buildings, or washing our meager clothing. At noon, we were given a small lunch, and then we worked for more hours until supper, usually around 6 p.m., or whenever the outside parties returned. Evening roll call was conducted at 8:30 p.m., and taps, that mournful sound, would echo through the camp between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m., depending on the season. Lights would go out immediately after taps, and in the oppressive darkness, the hungry, weary prisoners would try to forget the crushing thoughts that plagued their minds, clinging to the hope that sleep might offer an escape, even if only for a few hours. But rest was fleeting. When morning came, the bugle would summon us out to resume the relentless cycle of hard labor. This was the rhythm of our existence for nearly 4 years, except during the times it became even worse. Yet this was only part of the story of our captivity. The surface routine hit a far more profound battle, one fought for our very spirits. Beneath the daily grind of physical labor, there was a constant, unspoken war of wills for moral supremacy. On one side stood our captors, whose primary goal was to break our spirits and strip away our dignity. On the other side were the prisoners clinging to their self-respect, determined that no matter what they took from us, our pride would remain unbroken. This silent struggle, as bitter as it was perhaps as vital to our survival as the battle we fought on Wake Island. At Wong, our primary task was road repair. But the American prisoners, knowing the only weapon they had left was their will, became experts at slowdowns. They deliberately worked inefficiently, dragging their feet and making the task take as long as possible. Eventually, the Japanese gave up on the road project and shifted us to creating a large camp garden. However, after the seeds were planted, there was little work left to occupy us, and that idle time quickly became dangerous. Idleness in prison is a dangerous thing. It can erode a man's will to live. So we did what we could to stay busy. With our limited resources, I obtained permission from the Japanese commander to start a school with American officers as teachers. The classes were voluntary, focused on high school subjects, and though I'm not sure how much anyone actually learned, it helped to pass the bleak days and keep our minds sharp. We also laid out a baseball diamond, and some men took up whittling or building model planes, even though we had only makeshift tools for such crafts. One of the best whittlers in the camp was an old Army Master's sergeant, known for creating intricate cigarette holders from scraps of wood. These small acts of creativity helped us maintain a sense of normalcy and even pride amidst the overwhelming deprivation. But the Japanese were relentless in their attempts to break us, always looking for ways to assert their dominance, often with petty and humiliating rules. One such rule required us to salute Japanese non-commissioned officers, NCOs, just as we would salute their officers. But we weren't willing to comply. We refused, except when a Japanese NCO was serving as the officer of the day, in which case military protocol demanded respect. Despite our defiance, the Japanese at Wong didn't press the issue, perhaps because the prisoners were simply too numerous to control in such a petty matter, or perhaps because the atmosphere of cruelty in the camp left them with bigger fish to fry. Our conditions were harsh, as was to be expected. Food, clothing, and other necessities were always in short supply, but we were fortunate to have the support of American and British civilians in Shanghai. They sent us books, clothing, and whatever supplies they could spare. I'll never forget Mrs. Percy Shelley WWII, whom we came to know as Aunt B. She informally adopted 14 of the Wake Island officers, sending us food, knitted garments, and other essentials. In the dead of winter, her parcels were worth more than any money, offering us warmth and a taste of humanity in a place that was devoid of both. The Japanese took notice of the gifts she sent, but eventually allowed them to pass after she explained that all 14 of us were her nephews. When our first Red Cross parcels arrived at Christmas, 1942, a full year after our capture, we discovered that the Japanese had looted them. The camp commandant, Colonel Ashurst, was furious when he found out and refused to sign for any future shipments unless they were delivered intact. Each prisoner eventually received 17.5 Red Cross boxes, and those boxes quite literally saved our lives. The food and medical supplies inside helped our prisoner doctors keep the death rate among us as low as it would have been in any ordinary community. It was a lifeline, but the hunger for food wasn't the only hunger that plagued us. There was a far greater hunger that gnawed at us, the hunger for news from home. The Japanese refused to let us send letters home for more than 6 months after we were taken prisoner. Our first letter from home arrived in the fall of 1942, almost a full year after our capture. In total, we only received mail from home a dozen times during our entire captivity. And even then, the Japanese censored many of our letters, cutting out passages they deemed inappropriate, or worse yet, confiscating entire letters without informing the prisoner. There was no cruelty quite as subtle and torturous as the withholding of mail. I remember a particular batch of letters that arrived in November 1943, but we weren't allowed to receive them until March 1944. To anyone outside the camp, this might seem like a trivial irritation, but to the men imprisoned within those walls, it was an unbearable torment. There were nights when brave men who had faced the enemy with unwavering courage would cry in the dark because they hadn't received a letter. Exhausted and broken, they would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what was happening back home, wondering if anyone was even still alive. Yet, despite the oppressive conditions, the uncertainty, and the constant hunger, we clung to one thing: our pride. The Japanese could take our food, our letters, and our lives, but they could never take away our will to survive with dignity. And that, in the end, was the one thing that kept us going, even in the darkest moments. The preservation of our pride was paramount. From the very beginning, we insisted on maintaining military discipline among the prisoners. It was the only way to keep our identity as a military unit intact and avoid descending into chaos. If we abandoned that structure, we risked becoming nothing more than a mob with no cohesion or purpose. The officer's status was vital, not just for maintaining order, but for representing our men in dealings with the Japanese. It was through maintaining that military discipline that we were able to negotiate for provisions and medical care from our captors. More than that, it was our adherence to this discipline that allowed us to hold on to our morale over the long, grueling years of captivity. My insistence on saluting in the prison camp may seem absurd to some, especially given the dire circumstances we were facing, but it meant something to us. When the military personnel exchanged salutes, it was a small but powerful gesture that reminded us that despite our ragged clothes, our empty stomachs, and the relentless hardships, we were still part of something greater. The Japanese might have stripped away our belongings, our freedom, and our dignity, but they couldn't take away our sense of purpose or our self-respect. In that simple exchange, we maintained a semblance of pride, a code of conduct that transcended the harsh reality of the camp. It was a reminder that we were still men of honor, soldiers, and that the Japanese would never be able to break our spirit completely. Of course, like any group of men living in close quarters for extended periods, we faced our share of internal conflict. Disagreements over personalities, ideas, and frustrations often flared up, sometimes turning minor issues into major ones. The conditions of camp life made everything feel more intense, and tempers ran high. But maintaining discipline was key to resolving these conflicts. It kept us united against the common enemy, the Japanese, and prevented us from turning on each other. We knew that if we lost that unity, the Japanese would have succeeded in their goal of breaking us. Whenever a draft of prisoners was taken away for labor, I would give each man an identification paper. It was a simple piece of paper, typed with basic information, his name, rank, and a note that he was a member of the Wake Island Detachment of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion. The man would sign it, and I would certify it with my signature. To an outsider, it might have seemed insignificant, but to us it was a vital symbol of our identity, a tangible reminder that we were still part of something, still Americans, still Marines. No matter where we were taken, no matter what the Japanese did to us, that piece of paper was a thread that tied us to our past, to our comrades, and to the hope of eventual freedom. Some men still treasure those scraps of paper even today as a symbol of resilience and defiance. In the early days of captivity, we knew very little about the world beyond the electric fence that separated us from the outside. We received only occasional updates, old newspapers that passed from hand to hand, often in tatters by the time we finished reading them. The Japanese allowed us to have a radio in each barracks, but they were rigged to receive broadcasts from only French, German, or Russian stations in Shanghai. Yet somehow we managed to listen to news from home. I'm not entirely sure how it was done, and in a place like that, you learned quickly never to ask questions about things that could get you into trouble. All I know is that Lieutenant Kenny took our barracks radio and somehow managed to tune it to broadcast from the United States. For a while, the news we received was sparse and often grim, with little to lift our spirits. The Doolittle raid was one of the few bright spots, but then came that fateful day when Kenny told us about the Battle of the Coral Sea, and we could finally see a glimmer of hope. By the summer of 1942, the Japanese allowed us to write our first letters home. I wrote to my wife and my son, Patty. The International Red Cross had informed my wife in June that I was alive, but tragically, before my letter could reach her, she passed away. It was not until August that I received the news of her death from the Red Cross. The Japanese, in a rare moment of human decency, expressed their condolences and informed me that I could take 3 days off work, provided I maintained the proper attitude. I believe they were trying to show compassion, but as with most things they did, their efforts were clumsy and intrusive, leaving us feeling more confused than comforted. In April of 1943, nearly a year after my wife's passing, I was finally allowed to write to Patty. He was 9 years old at the time and living with my wife's parents, Colonel and Mrs. J.P. Welch, at the Army post on Governor's Island. This letter, now part of my life in captivity, was a deeply personal one, but it became public when it was shared with the press. It was a compromise between the privacy I intended and the necessity of communicating my feelings in such a dire situation. Here's what I wrote. Dear Patty, our loss must have been a tremendous shock to you. It certainly was to me. We both loved your mother so much, and I only wish I could be there with you. However, you are fortunate to have your grandparents looking after you, and I know they are taking good care of you. I hope you received the recording I made last fall. Since this is my first letter to you, I want to say that I hope you're doing well in church and school. Keep up the good work. Both will be very important to you later in life. I also want to ask your grandmother to have you take swimming and riding lessons. It doesn't matter how well you perform, but I do want you to enjoy it. We'll need your help with the horses when we get our farm. Your mother told me you were growing strong and doing well at the post. I'm proud of you. As for the Marines at Wake Island, we did well, but remember, we were just doing our duty. Anyone would have done the same. The work behind the front lines is just as important as the fighting at the front. I've enclosed a picture of myself from this winter. You'll see that I'm doing well, as are most of the men. We all hope to go home soon, and if there is an exchange, we should be among the first. Please write whenever you can. I know you've been staying with your cousins, and I imagine you'll visit them again this summer. Please let everyone know you've heard from me and give them all my love. Your affectionate father, Daddy. This letter, like so many others, was a small but vital connection to home, a tether to the world outside that gave us strength during the darkest times of our captivity. In 1942, after a guerrilla sniper took down a Japanese sentry at Wong, the prisoners were marched to another camp 5 miles away, located at Kiang Wong. This new camp was nearly identical to Wong, but it would become infamous in the memories of the Marines as the most brutal of all their captivity. The reason for this was the Mount Fuji project, a construction assignment that subjected the prisoners to grueling labor under the sadistic supervision of Lieutenant Ishihara. Officially, the project was said to be a recreation park, but in reality it was a rifle range designed to further humiliate the prisoners. Ishihara forced them to work up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, at a pace so relentless that many of the weakened men could no longer continue. Those who fell behind were only driven harder. The men were broken, their physical and mental endurance pushed to the brink of collapse. Most of the prisoners had little money, surviving only on what they were paid for their labor, a paltry sum paid in Chinese currency, which was almost worthless. A private had to work for 3 full days to earn the price of a small loaf of Japanese bread or a pack of cigarettes. Some of the North China Marines were in slightly better circumstances, having smuggled in American currency before their capture. They were able to exchange it for Chinese money or military yen, which were required for all purchases. However, the official exchange rate was so low that they were hesitant to part with their American dollars. Eventually, they found a black market trading through the Chinese collies at Mount Fuji. Ishihara turned a blind eye to these dealings at first, but his greed soon overwhelmed him, and he demanded a larger share of the profits. The men, tired of his insatiable demands, shut down the black market, prompting Ishihara to report the activity to the camp authorities. This led to the worst inquisition the prisoners had faced yet. The prisoners who were suspected of participating in the black market were summoned for questioning. Lieutenant Foley, a Navy medical officer from Tinian, was among the first. After his interrogation, he was carried out unconscious, his body too battered to stand. Many other prisoners endured the same fate. They were beaten mercilessly, their thumbs twisted and pulled until it seemed they would tear from their hands. Some were subjected to the water cure, a torturous method where a tube was shoved into their mouths and water was forced down their throats until they passed out from the pressure. Despite the excruciating pain, none of the prisoners confessed to anything. Colonel Ashurst and I managed to avoid interrogation. His seniority helped him, but I can only guess why I was spared. Perhaps it was my ability to speak a little French. The camp's commandant, Colonel Otera, was fond of practicing his limited French with me during his inspections, and I believe the guards, seeing us conversing in the language, assumed I was under his protection. For whatever reason, I was left unharmed. After weeks of cruel investigations, the Japanese pieced together a fragmented story of the black market operation, largely based on the confessions of Chinese informants and a civilian prisoner who had earned the nickname the White Mouse for his cooperation with the authorities. The men identified as guilty were confined to the brig for the night and then placed under house arrest for a month. The White Mouse, rewarded for his betrayal, was promoted to a position of power known as honcho or straw boss. However, his betrayal came at a steep price. No one in camp would speak to him again. By the summer of 1943, the physical toll of the Mount Fuji project was becoming apparent. Tuberculosis spread like wildfire, and even those who managed to stay on their feet were little more than skin and bones. I remember one man whose waistline shrank by 8 inches. In response, Commander Leo Thyssen, our senior medical officer, attempted to segregate the tuberculosis patients and ensure they had some rest, but that was all we could do. We were never provided with medical instruments, which meant our doctors were powerless to treat the diseased lungs. Ironically, such instruments were available in Shanghai, a bustling city just beyond our prison walls. The lack of medical care compounded the suffering. When the Mount Fuji project finally came to an end, it was a day of mixed emotions. Some prisoners were reassigned to work at a gasoline and alcohol dump, which, in a twisted form of resistance, allowed them to combine sabotage with pleasure. The Marines found ways to tap the Japanese alcohol supply, using inventive methods to smuggle it back to their barracks. One Marine, for example, stole a section of the inner tube from the tire repair shop, filled it with alcohol, and wore it like a girdle, passing unnoticed by the guards. While the men were desperate for any kind of reprieve, the alcohol proved to be a dangerous crutch. The physical state of the men, already fragile from malnutrition, meant that they were ill-equipped to handle the alcohol. One Marine was soon caught intoxicated, and when questioned, offered a creative excuse. "I've got aches in my bones," he said, "and I need it for massage." The Japanese officers absurdly bought the story and allowed him to take a bottle of alcohol with him to the brig, making him the most envied man in camp. However, his luck didn't last. Only a week later, he was found drunk again. This time, he was hauled before Colonel Otera, who demanded to know what should be done with such a habitual offender. The Marine, undeterred, simply replied, "I don't know, sir. I reckon you better shoot me." The colonel, taken aback by the audacity, could only respond with a stunned silence before letting the Marine off with a warning. Throughout the entire ordeal of our captivity, one thought occupied the minds of all the men: the possibility of escape. The first attempt occurred shortly after we arrived at Wong, in March 1942 when 5 prisoners made a break for it. 2 of them were from Wake Island, Commander Cunningham and Mr. Teeters. They crawled beneath the electrified fence, hoping to find refuge with the Chinese guerrilla bands. But their hopes were dashed within 24 hours when they were captured and brought back to camp. The 5 men were paraded in front of the other prisoners as a warning before being sent to Shanghai for trial. The harsh punishment they received served as a reminder of the price of defiance and the constant vigilance we needed to maintain if we ever hoped to escape the nightmare we were living. Sentenced to 10 years of close confinement in a Japanese prison for the crime of desertion, Commander Cunningham took a monumental risk by attempting an escape. He had crucial information that he believed could benefit the United States Navy, making his escape a matter of strategic importance. Unlike Cunningham, I had no such personal incentive. My contribution to our military intelligence came in a different form. Quartermaster Clark Paul Chandler, who later became lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps, was another prisoner with a unique connection to the outside world. Chandler had been captured in Shanghai, but his status as a diplomat, attached to the consular service for property sales negotiations, gave him a slight edge. This diplomatic status meant he had access to information that could help our cause. After the 4th Marines had been evacuated from Shanghai before the war broke out, Chandler joined us as one of the Shanghai prisoners. It wasn't long before word spread that some prisoners with diplomatic status, including Chandler and a few civilians, would be repatriated. I took the opportunity to have a private conversation with Chandler. I provided him with our casualty figures, a list of the dead, and an account of how the Japanese had successfully launched their final attack without naval gunfire support and under the cover of night. I asked him to inform our headquarters of these developments. I also stressed the importance of reporting back with as much detail as possible. Soon after this exchange, the prisoners due for repatriation were put under close guard, likely to prevent us from sending any messages or attempting further contact with the outside world. Despite this precaution, the Japanese were always a little too late to stifle us completely. As for myself, I didn't feel justified in attempting to escape. Given my role as one of the senior Marine officers, I considered it my responsibility to stay with my men as long as I could, to maintain discipline and morale, to represent them to the Japanese authorities, and to keep as many alive as possible until the war ended. It was not a decision made out of any sense of adventure, but rather out of duty. I firmly believed that events would justify this decision in the end. Regardless of the temptation to escape, nobody ever successfully fled from Wong or Kiangwang. Despite our grim situation, we were able to follow the progress of the war through makeshift radios, created from scavenged parts, baling wire, and ingenuity. In addition to these secret transmissions, we received updates from new prisoners who arrived, bringing news from the front lines. In the winter of 1944, we were elated, but not surprised, when B-29 bombers began to raid Japanese installations near Shanghai. This gave us hope, but our real thrill came in the spring of 1945, when a flight of P-51 fighter planes passed over us so low that we could wave at the pilots. For the first time in years, it felt like the American forces were close, establishing a base not far from where we were imprisoned. The presence of these planes made the guards increasingly erratic. The more the American airstrikes intensified, the more paranoid and frantic the Japanese guards became. During air raid drills, they would herd us into the barracks, jabbing us with bayonets and screaming at us. On one occasion, they became so rattled that they fired at the raiding planes from the windows of the barracks, a clear violation of the rules of warfare. However, their terrified and ineffective gunfire amused us more than anything else, revealing the deep cracks in their discipline and control. In early May 1945, the Japanese began moving us from Kiangwang to a new location, Fangai, located near Peking, about 700 miles north. They loaded us into freight cars for the long journey. The officers were fortunate, with only 25 men per car, but the enlisted men and civilians were crammed into cars with as many as 50 men in each. These cars were not designed to hold so many, making it impossible for everyone to lie down at once. Between the sliding doors, each car was divided into sections, with the middle section wired off to prevent any prisoners from rushing the guards. The windows were small, each covered with wire, and at night only a single oil lamp illuminated the darkened cars. Soon we discovered a way to use the light to our advantage. By hanging clothing near the lamp, we were able to block the light from one window at a time, and we noticed the wires across the windows were loose. With the guards drowsing and the train crawling along at barely 20 miles per hour, we saw an opportunity for escape. The next night, the train lurched to an unexpected stop, and angry Japanese officers stormed into the cars, weapons drawn. As they counted heads and shouted threats, we learned that 5 officers, Lieutenants Kenny and Mallister of the Wake Islanders, W. Zenger and McCraw of the North China Marines, and Bishop, a Flying Tiger, had managed to escape through a window in the car ahead. Colonel Otera, furious beyond belief, announced that he was placing himself under arrest. In response to the escape, the Japanese took extreme measures to prevent any further attempts. They wedged the windows shut and stationed an officer with a drawn sword in the guard section of each car. But even with these precautions, the next night, 2 civilian prisoners managed to escape. One was recaptured and brutally abused to the point of mental collapse, but the other civilian, along with the 5 officers, managed to navigate their way to safety. They split up as they fled the train, but eventually reunited after reaching Chinese communist guerrilla bands. For the next 47 days, the escaped prisoners traveled approximately 700 miles on foot, horseback, and by boat, crossing enemy lines and moving through hostile territory. In a report later submitted after his return to the United States, Lieutenant Mallister explained that while with the Chinese communists, they were treated well, provided food, medicine, clothing, and even a sum of 100,000 Chinese currency. They visited communist factories, schools, hospitals, and military units along the way. Afterward, the Americans were passed to nationalist Chinese troops, where they were given equally excellent treatment for a period of 14 days. The journey was difficult, but the escapees had not only survived, but had been given the opportunity to witness firsthand the efforts of Chinese forces working to fight against the Japanese occupation. Meanwhile, our own captivity continued as our train took 5 days to reach the town of Fun Ta. When we arrived, we found fewer facilities and worse food than at Wong or Kiangwang. By June 19th, we began another harrowing journey, a 4-day boxcar trip to the port of Fusan in Korea, where we would face yet another chapter in our captivity. But in the midst of these dark times, the actions of the escapees reminded us that the fight for freedom was far from over, and that there was always hope, no matter how small the spark. We were forced to march 3 miles through ankle-deep mud to the camp, our bodies weak and exhausted. Among the prisoners were elderly men, some barely able to move, but the Japanese soldiers showed no mercy. They relentlessly prodded us on, refusing to let us help those who slipped and fell in the thick mud. I still can't erase the image of a one-legged pilot trying to hobble along using crude crutches we had fashioned for him. Fusan, where we arrived next, was even worse than Fang Ta. The conditions were appalling, and the stench of filth was overpowering. We had to brush swarms of flies away with one hand while trying to eat with the other. The food we were given resembled garbage, and nearly all of us were suffering from dysentery. Just 3 days after our arrival, we were marched to the docks and packed like sardines into the fetid, airless lower deck of a ferry. The 12-hour journey to Honshu, Japan's main island, was far worse than the 9 days we had spent in the cramped boxcars. Upon arrival, we were crammed into day coaches, 170 prisoners in cars meant to hold only 88. The guards insisted we keep the blinds drawn, but we still managed to steal glimpses of the countryside as we passed. For miles, there was nothing but devastation. Towns and villages lay in ruins, their buildings reduced to rubble. As weak as we were, the sight made us exchange glances and grin. It was clear that the Japanese war effort had crumbled, and although we were heading north, we had no idea what awaited us. Our rations changed slightly during the trip, no longer just raw fish with rice, but fried grasshoppers. When we finally reached Takagawa on Hokkaido Island on July 6th, We were separated from the enlisted men. 35 of us officers were taken to another camp. I barely had time to remind my men to stick together, to maintain discipline, and to continue acting as Marines, even in the face of such hardship. At Nishiibetsu, about 20 miles from Takagawa, we were shocked to find 45 Australian officers already there. These men had been captured at Rabaul, and after years in captivity were little more than walking skeletons. When the Japanese made us volunteer for manual labor, the Australians were the first to agree, knowing it would mean an extra ration of rice. Our task was to clear land for a garden, but within a month, most of us were moved to a nearby lumber yard to carry timber and gravel to a coal mine. Enlisted men from surrounding camps were forced to work underground, enduring 12 to 14-hour shifts each day. We didn't hear anything about the atomic bomb until one day Lieutenant Commander Gree and I were walking back from work. We passed a group of British soldiers who casually mentioned that they were having a bowl of caviar that night. One of them muttered something about Joe being in, which was how we learned that Russia had declared war on Japan. The news was enough to make the Japanese guards change their attitude toward us. They began singing a softer tune, even allowing us to swim in the river below the camp. A Japanese soldier speaking broken English told us, "Very soon we will all be friends again." The guards had a radio in their office in our barracks, but we could never understand what was being broadcast. One day, the Japanese soldiers crowded into the office, even women joining in, all eager to hear the news. We could only watch as the radio blared, uncertain of what was happening. Suddenly, a woman who worked in their kitchen screamed and sobbed uncontrollably. The guards, looking pale and sick, began to leave the office. It was August 14th, the day the Japanese heard the news of Japan's surrender. But no one told us directly. Instead, the announcement was made that there would be no working parties the next day. From that moment, it felt as if every day was like Christmas. Our cigarette rations, which had been reduced to nothing over the months, were restored. The food, though still far from ideal, improved, and we even began receiving vegetables and sugar. The guards' attitude softened further, and they became more friendly. Though we knew that the war had changed, it was difficult to gauge the true extent of the shift. It felt as though the Japanese were simply relaxing their strictness bit by bit, but they still held control. The officers continued their work details, gathering firewood and cooking our own food, all the while policing ourselves to maintain order. On August 18th, an English-speaking Japanese officer came to the camp and announced, "We have decided to stop fighting, though our army has not been beaten in the field." Some of us were allowed to visit a nearby house where a Japanese man translated the news for us. We learned that Japan intended to retain control of its homeland and keep the emperor in power. The officer suggested that it was a negotiated peace, though we didn't yet understand the full truth. We remained in the dark until August 20th, when representatives from the International Red Cross arrived at our camp. Before the Red Cross men came, the Japanese had prepared a first aid room in our barracks, outfitting it with medical equipment we had never seen before. They tried to pass it off as something they had always had available for our benefit, though we knew better. We were eager to leave and return home, but the word came down that we would remain in the camps until all our records were checked and transportation could be arranged. By early September, we had gradually taken over the administration of the camp. On September 5th, I made my way to one of the men's camps. Many of the prisoners there were my own men. Among the first I encountered was Private First Class H.D. Lawrence, who had taken exceptional care of me throughout our imprisonment. He had been a reliable and steadfast presence, always looking out for me whenever he wasn't forced to work for the Japanese. One night, the Japanese organized a dinner party for us at the Mine Officials Club. We attended, believing that perhaps it would help reassure the Japanese people that we were not the ruthless barbarians their propaganda had painted us as. Maybe we thought this would ease the process of occupying Japan after the war. If that was a condition of peace, it seemed like a small price to pay. When Japan's surrender was announced, the information we had was still incomplete, and it led us to believe that only a few strategic points would be taken over. Our Japanese hosts, perhaps trying to ease their conscience, were unexpectedly generous, offering us good food and wine. But then, in a tone that seemed almost too audacious, one of the top officials raised his glass to propose a toast to everlasting friendship between America and Japan. Major Brown of the North China Marines was the first to respond. He stood silently for a moment, his mind racing back to the atrocities we had endured. He remembered Ishihara and the endless starvation and torture our men had suffered. He recalled the cold, arrogant brutality of the Japanese soldiers who had tormented us. With a steady voice, Major Brown finally spoke. "If you behave yourselves," he said, "you'll get fair treatment." His words cut through the room, a quiet yet powerful declaration of the reality that had shaped our experiences. By September 10th, a few American rescue teams arrived at our camp. They seemed slightly disappointed that we were getting along so well under the circumstances. At least that's how it appeared to them, given the conditions we had endured. We had managed to rig up a radio receiver, and we had already begun sending out the first of our men, including the sick British and American merchant marine officers and service personnel, under the command of Gunner McKinstry. More men were scheduled to leave by September 14th, following a message from Rear Admiral Beauty Martin. In a moment that seemed almost surreal, I traveled to Chosi Airfield and took off on a Navy plane on September 15th. When I finally touched down on the deck of Admiral Martin's flagship, the escort carrier Hogg at Bay, I could hardly believe it. I had set foot on American soil for the first time since our surrender. There I was greeted by an old friend, Captain Joe Briggs, and then treated to a meal as Admiral Martin's guest. The Admiral was an impeccable host, but for my first American meal, he served me rice that tasted like home after all the months of deprivation. Admiral Fighting Jack Fletcher, who commanded the North Pacific Fleet, graciously put me up on his flagship for the night. The next day, I flew to Tokyo to pick up some Wake Island officers. By September 17th, we were in Guam, then Pearl Harbor on September 19th, and finally Washington, D.C. by September 26th. While these dates are clear in my mind, no record or timeline can adequately capture the emotions that came with finally returning home. What I remember most vividly was the warmth and hospitality we received from everyone, even from complete strangers. Colonel Samuel Howard, who had commanded the 4th Marines at Bataan and Corregidor, summed it up best when he said, "If this keeps up, they'll kill us with kindness." But for me, the most memorable moment came when I reached Washington. There, in the crowd of well-wishers, friends, and family, the only face I saw was that of my son, Patty, coming toward me. I suppose that someday in the normal course of my service, I'll return to Hawaii for another tour of duty. When that day comes, after I fulfill my official duties, I know exactly what I'll do first. I'll seek out a man who truly deserves a place in the history of Wake Island. That man is Ambrose C. Lum, who was posthumously honored as an honorary private first class in the United States Marines. Ambrose, of Chinese descent but born in Honolulu, was a proud American citizen. He was an invaluable asset to us, serving as both an orderly and a handyman during the war. When the fighting started, Ambrose adopted the Marines as his own, especially Corporal Robert M. Brown, who became his close friend. Ambrose had a unique sense of humor, often joking about his larger-than-average feat, a result, he said, of growing up with the good food of an American home, plenty of milk, butter, and eggs. Despite his quickness to dive for shelter when the bombs fell, he never hesitated to risk his life for others. On one occasion, during a bombing raid, he noticed that Corporal Brown had slipped off into the brush for a nap. Panicked, Ambrose cried out, "Where's Bob?" When someone explained that Brown was just sleeping, Ambrose dashed into the brush to wake him. They had only moments to spare before the first bombs started falling. They raced for cover, and when the raid was over, Ambrose went back to the spot to collect Corporal Brown's gear, only to find a bomb crater where his blankets had been. Ambrose was with us throughout our captivity, and as a Chinese American, he became a crucial connection to the black market, smuggling in necessities and even small luxuries. He could have exploited his position for personal gain, but he never did. When the Japanese began their inquisition into the black market, they promised Ambrose immunity if he would turn on the American prisoners. He refused. They beat him senseless, forced water down his throat until he passed out, but he never gave them a name. Even when they tried to persuade him with promises of privileges, Ambrose remained defiant. "I may be a Yao man like you," he said, "but I'm an American citizen. You better be careful what you do to me." The Japanese, frustrated by his resistance, finally gave up on trying to break him. It was because of his steadfast loyalty and courage that the Marines decided to honor him in the only way they could, by electing him an honorary private first class in the United States Marine Corps. I was told that Ambrose had tears in his eyes when he was informed of this honor. When the war was over and he returned to Honolulu, Ambrose had a vision. Before the war, he had been in the canary bird business and had saved a considerable amount of money. He decided to open a new business, a bar, but not just any bar. It would be the most exclusive bar in the world, named the Wake Island Marine Bar. The only customers allowed would be Marines or the guests of Marines. Ambrose explained to Corporal Brown in the prison camp, "I want to show how I feel about the honor. Marines got to stick together. When that day comes, I'll be there with Ambrose, raising a glass to the bond we shared, to the brotherhood that sustained us through the darkest of times."